What's up, Guru Nation? Let's demystify clinical research. Guru Nation, welcome back to another video. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you like, subscribe, comment, share. Going live on Instagram too. I can't see what you're writing, but write stuff. I'll look later. This is an important video. I think a lot of people are getting confused about the stakeholders in this space, and it's going to be 20 minutes or so on the important stakeholders in research and the different types of roles in this space. Because what I've noticed at Yuma Clinical Trials, sometimes even my own employees, they don't know the difference. Like, what's a sponsor versus a CRO? Like, sometimes these things are so intermingled that you forget that they're separate companies. And the longer you work in this space, the more you start noticing nuances and intricacies between the various stakeholders. So I'm going to start with the two most common positions first. I think the best way to go about it would be to start with the difference between a CRC and a CRA, because those are by far the two most common positions in clinical research. And then we can kind of work our way into some of the lesser known positions: in-house CRA, medical monitor, pharmacovigilance, biostat. I mean, I won't cover nearly all of them, like not even close, but I'm going to try to give an overview so that there's less confusion, and hopefully it alleviates some of the mystery around our industry. So CRC versus CRA. The main difference, the main way to tell them apart, you'll know one if you are one, you'll know what you are. But if you're an outsider looking in, if you have patient interaction, you're a CRC. And a CRA does not have any interaction with the patients, but they review the data that's collected by the CRCs for their study. So CRC generates the data usually, and CRA reviews the data from either the sponsor or the CRO level. That's probably the easiest way to tell the difference between those two positions. Now, sometimes it gets confusing because the line gets blurred between site and CRO. And initially I was going to do the video today on why, if you're an entrepreneur in this space, why you don't want to start a CRO as your first company. And so I decided to skip that one. We'll save it for another video. But there are a lot of similarities between sites and CROs that I think people get confused. And there are some CROs, especially on the phase 1 side, where they also operate kind of as sites. And so those companies will have CRAs and CRCs employed by them. And then some of the big CROs, as far as I can remember, all of them, like Kivia, PPD, they're all CROs, so they all employ CRAs. That's like their primary core competency. But they also do, when it comes to phase 1, they also own phase 1 clinics. So those same organizations will hire coordinators, usually to do healthy volunteer testing. So to an outsider, this is absolutely confusing. But this video hopefully is going to help break down like how to make it clear and concise for you guys. So with the site, let's start with the site level. The site is where the patients are seen. The research site is where typically the coordinators work and where the principal investigator works. So, and where the patients actually come in to be seen by the PI, sub-I, or the coordinators. So investigator is another term that's confusing to a lot of people, because there's principal investigator and then there's sub-investigators, and they're clinicians. That's what you need to know. Now, not every sub-investigator needs to be a clinician. I'm actually a sub-investigator on one study we're doing right now, and I'm not a clinician, never have been a clinician, but it's a psychiatric trial, so we're doing a rating scale, and I'm one of the psychometric raters. So for that study, they want me listed as a sub-investigator. So technically I'm a sub-investigator, but in reality I'm more of a CRC / site director. The site is where the action happens, where the data is generated. So when a patient comes into a study, they go to a site, they sign the informed consent form, they go through the visits. A coordinator is walking them through the entire visit, making sure protocol, GCP is being followed. A PI is having oversight. So, from a safety perspective, the principal investigator is having oversight over the conduct of the trial at their site. The patients are usually the patients of the PI, but not always. Sites can get referrals from outside of the PI's private practice if the site so chooses. I know some sites that do not allow outside referrals, but those are few and far between. Most sites do encourage referrals from the community. So not every patient is going to be the patient of the principal investigator, but for the most part, they are the principal investigator's patients. So the PI is in charge of safety oversight. The PI can delegate to all his or her staff, including sub-investigators, including nurse practitioners, including RNs, including medical assistants, including clinical research coordinators. They can delegate the functions of a task. We've talked about the DOA logs before, the delegation of authorities logs. We've talked about the 1572. Box 6 is where the sub-investigators are listed. If you want to look at a 1572, it's actually going to show you a lot of information about the study. It's going to show you the name of the PI. It's going to show you the labs. It's going to show you the IRB. It's going to show you who the sub-investigators are and the physical location of the sites for that principal investigator. Yes, you can have more than one site as a PI on a study. So the way we have a setup at Yuma Clinical Trials, we have a clinic where patients are actually seen. That's obviously listed on the 1572. But we also have an off-site location where I'm sitting right now, actually, where we do further paperwork when the patients are gone, where we can store extra investigational product, we can store extra lab supplies, we can store all kinds of other things that may or may not have to go on the 1572, but technically that is a site. If you're going to see patients there, it should go on the 1572, and if you're going to store investigational product, that should go on the 1572. So those are the key players at the site level, and that's one of the main stakeholders in this space are the sites. So just to recap, the sites employ PIs, sub-Is, coordinators, and if they want research assistants, unblinded pharmacists, blinded staff, unblinded staff, just it all depends on what the protocol calls for. We have a study where it requires unblinded pharmacist. In our case, that happens to be 2 medical assistants that the PI delegated to perform that role. So the idea is we're keeping the staff, our research staff, our coordinators, blind from the actual identity of the investigational product, because in this particular study, it would be impossible to mask the identity of the IP if you're preparing it. So therefore, we have an unblinded pharmacist do it. So those are the key players and the key positions at the site. The most important, the backbone of any study is the coordinator. They do 90% of the work. The PIs really do the safety oversight. And then you have sub-investigators who help out with various assessments. Like today myself, I was a sub-I, like I said. I did like 3 or 4 assessments. It probably took me about an hour, hour and a half. I served the role as a sub-investigator while the coordinator was there making sure everything's going smoothly and troubleshooting all kinds of stuff that occurs during a study visit, especially a new study visit. So that's the site. CRC, again, direct patient interaction. And CRAs come to the site. This is where people really get confused, and I can see how it's confusing to an outsider. CRAs do come on site, but they are not employed by the site, and they do not have any patient interaction. All they do is look at the source data and look at the EDC and look at the investigational product and look at the regulatory binders and make sure that action items are being followed up with and that queries are being answered and that the data is being collected as per Alcoa-C and that the study is being conducted as per good clinical practice and all that stuff. So CRAs do this at multiple sites, whereas CRCs typically only work at one site at a time. There are some CRCs that work at multiple sites at once. Those are called traveling CRCs, but that's such a minority cohort of the clinical research coordinator position that it's not really worth talking about, but I figure I mentioned it here as well. So we kind of got the site taken care of. I have entire hour-long videos on sites, how they work. We're going to do more as well, but let's get the sites out of the way. CROs, contract research organizations, right? IQVIA, PPD, Premier, Cineos, Covance, I forgot what they've turned themselves into. Those are like the big ones. And then you have a long tail of smaller ones. But even the big ones, like I said earlier, their core competency is monitoring studies, so employing CRAs to go to the sites and do source data verification, source data review. But they also, and it's a very small part of their business, own phase 1 research sites and sometimes even phase 2 and beyond research sites. And then you get into the long tail of these CROs where you get past like the big 5 and you get into the smaller market cap sized CROs. They actually may blur the line even more between CRO and site. And there's been a trend lately of CROs acquiring sites and who knows for what purpose. But the core competency, as far as this video, is to monitor studies. And the CRO is literally tasked with assisting the sponsor in implementing their protocols. And that's everything from assisting with writing the protocol, assisting with selecting the sites for the study, assisting with monitoring the study, which is a huge part of what they do, with data management, so making sure the data is clean and able to be packaged and submitted to the FDA, with pharmacovigilance, which is drug safety, with the data management committee team, with overseeing the IRB, selecting the vendors. We're going to get into the vendors also after we talk about sponsors. But the CROs basically do the majority of the heavy lifting for most sponsors. Now, a lot of sponsors, although still not the majority, but a lot of sponsors choose to not use a CRO. And they're allowed to do that. We actually have a study, the study I'm mentioning that I am a sub-investigator on, that we had a screening visit earlier today. They're a sponsor. They're a small one. They don't use a CRO. So it's direct. Sponsor does all the functions of the CRO in this particular case. The problem with that, and the reason why more sponsors don't utilize this strategy, is because it's not their core competency. Their core competency is creating the drugs and then selling the drugs once they get approval. So it's not common for a sponsor to manage their own trial from end to end without a CRO. But there are those that do, and they vary in size from the very small biotechs to the very big pharma. So it's just, that's an internal decision that the sponsors are assessing themselves internally on a year-by-year basis. I would say even quarter-by-quarter basis. There's definitely advantages to using a CRO, and there's disadvantages. That's not really the purpose of this video, so we're not going to get into that. Maybe that's another video for a future date. But because of all the work that the CROs actually do, there's a lot of staff that they could potentially hire, and there's a lot of positions that these CROs can hire and usually do. So let's start with the most common, CRA. Like we've said, CRAs go to different sites and they make sure they're usually assigned 1 or 2 protocols at a time, and anywhere from 4 to 12 sites. And they'll usually go every 6 to 8 weeks to do an on-site interim monitoring visit to each site. So when they're there, they're going to do everything I mentioned before. That's the CRA. That's probably the core competency of most CROs, and that's probably what most sites are familiar with. But behind the scenes, there's a lot of other positions. Study startup specialist. Once the sites have been identified and which ones the sponsor and CRO decides will be used for any given study, there's a study startup specialist that usually sends startup regulatory material to the sites. So we've done a video on startup regulatory. I'm not going to get into that in this one. If you want to learn about that, you got to go watch that video. But that's what the study startup specialists do. They make sure that the sites are getting the study startup regulatory documents completed, all their training done, and basically everything that the site needs in order to be ready for site initiation visit. So that's usually study startup specialist. Some CROs call this position an in-house CRA. Other CROs may call this remote site monitor. The job titles will vary, but the job responsibilities are basically the same. So you also have feasibility analysts and feasibility managers and various roles and responsibilities within the feasibility departments of some of these CROs. These are before the sites are selected. This is the process. It's the whole feasibility process of what these individuals, this is their primary function at the CROs, is to go through the feasibility process with sites and make the decision with the sponsor on what criteria are important, what metrics they're going to be using in order to get a site approved to be on a study. One of my sponsors, actually, Inato, they are not a CRO. They're a tech vendor. We're going to get to tech vendors last. They actually help. Their core competency as a tech vendor is feasibility and site selection, although they don't do the actual site selection, and I'll save that for the tech vendors. But that's feasibility. Then there's study startup. Then there's the actual clinical operations team. That's where you have the monitors, the in-house CRAs, the remote site monitors, the medical monitors, the clinical trial assistants, all the support roles that are helping the CRA do their job of making sure the data being collected at the sites is usable and making sure that the study is going according to plan from a recruitment perspective, from a quality perspective. You have a lot of support roles from assistants to the CRAs to project managers to clinical trial managers to study directors. Then you get into the safety team. So you've got medical monitors. Medical monitors are usually pharmacists or clinicians, MDs. They could be foreign MDs too. So a lot of you guys watching, you guys and gals, international medical graduates that end up being CRCs, you could be a medical monitor. It's not going to happen overnight. You got to work your way into that role, but it's a very good role, a very important role in a study. The medical monitor is there to clarify any inclusion-exclusion criteria questions the sites might have. The medical monitor is there to grant potential waivers or the final approval of whether a patient qualifies to be randomized in a study or not. And they also, of course, get involved on the serious adverse event reporting side. Whenever a site has an SAE to report, the medical monitors are usually notified, and they'll decide SUSARs or not SUSARs and all that stuff. And then very related to the medical monitor is the pharmacovigilance team. So again, it's patient safety, but these guys are really looking at adverse events of special interest, and they're also looking at SUSARs, suspected unexpected serious adverse reactions. So these guys doing the SUSARs, these guys doing the AEs of special interest, and are making sure that the FDA is getting the data that they need to see. These are the pharmacovigilance teams, PV. Then you have biostats. At the end of the study or whenever a database has been locked, interim database lock, you have the biostats team looking at the numbers, looking at the stats, and then internally deciding as a sponsor or as a CRO, hey, do we continue with this study? Do we change the protocol design to allow more enrollment? These are usually done by biostats in conjunction with project managers, study directors, and of course the sponsors. So more or less, those are the main roles at the CRO level. And now you have the sponsor level, and a lot of these roles that I mentioned at the CRO level are also at the sponsor level, maybe just in fewer numbers. So if a CRO hires CRAs, sometimes a sponsor will have like someone in charge of the CRAs from the sponsor level. I've interviewed someone on this podcast recently, Robert Goldman. He's a study director at a sponsor level, and his career got started as a CRA. So he was a CRA with a big CRO for maybe a decade. Then he became a study director with a sponsor. So he's in charge of overseeing the CRO and all their functions and all the CRAs and basically everything that goes into running a smooth and successful trial. So at the sponsor level, you also have all the roles I mentioned. Whether they use a CRO or not will determine whether they need more of these individuals or less. So if a sponsor is using a CRO for a study, they might have their own pharmacovigilance team. They might have their own stats team. They might have their own management team for the data. They might have everything the CRO has, just in less numbers. So these are basically like overseers. And if they're not using a CRO, they'll probably have more because they need more human resources at that point to actually interact with the sites. So a general rule of thumb, if a CRO is not being used, the sponsor typically has more direct interaction with sites. If a CRO is being used, a sponsor will have less interaction with sites. So that's the sponsor level. The most important thing about the sponsor is that they also pay for the study and they own the rights to the investigational product. They own publishing rights and they own the actual commercial rights. So they own the IND and they hope that they will own the NDA when the drug gets approved, if it gets approved. So they're the owner. They're ultimately who makes the final decisions for most things related to the study. They can defer to the CRO a lot, but ultimately the final decision is with the sponsor, and the FDA holds the sponsor responsible for their overall conduct of the study. Whether or not they use a CRO, the FDA will hold the sponsor responsible and solely the sponsor responsible, just like they hold solely the investigator, the PI, responsible for the conduct of the study at that particular site. They solely hold the sponsor responsible for the conduct of the study overall. The last stakeholder here are the tech vendors. And they're gaining more and more market share. Four of my sponsors, all of my sponsors on this podcast, Versatrail, Viva, SiteVault, Creo, and Inato, they're all tech vendors. And they all serve to provide tools for either sites. In the case of my sponsors, they're all site-centric tech vendors. But there are tech vendors that service just CROs and sponsors, and there are tech vendors that service all three stakeholders, and there are those that serve just one or two. The ones I mentioned are site-centric, with the exception of Viva and Inato, where they also serve the sponsors, because if you remember the feasibility discussion I had just a few minutes ago, Inato really works on this aspect of selecting sites, particularly with a diverse patient population, to identify and assist sponsors in site selection. Ultimately, they give the final responsibility to the sponsor to select them. I'm actually going through a study right now where we used Inato for them to identify us. They went through our database. They asked us questions about our capabilities. Finally, They approved us and they passed us off to the sponsor to do a site selection visit, and we're going to pretty soon have startup regulatory and all that stuff. So the tech vendors, this is where the job titles are being created almost every day because the technology is moving so quickly. You have eSource, you have eReg, you have platforms like Versatrial, which help you organize your studies. You have all these different tech vendors, and they're always looking for experience from their employees from either one of these three stakeholders perspective, depending on who that tech vendor primarily focuses on selling their product or service to. So that's the stakeholders, that's the key players in this space employee wise. Thank you guys for watching. Hopefully it helps. Like, subscribe, comment, share. Catch y'all later. Bye bye.